All right, so now that we've learned about the basic components of constraints, namely alignment and pinning, we're ready to move on to our more complex interface, which is our main.storyboard. So if we head over there, you can see that we've got the same kind of green background and we want it to cover all four sides. So as the first challenge to review what you learned in the last lesson, add some constraints to that background green felt so that even when it's in landscape, it covers all four sides without stopping at any of the safe areas. Pause the video and try to complete this challenge. All right, so just as before, we're going to select the item that we want to add a constraint to, either in the document outline or on the canvas, depending on how cluttered it is. And then we're going to go and set our constraints to be 0 from all four sides. And we can click on the drop down to make sure that it's actually selecting the view rather than the safe areas. And now we've got 0 from all four sides of the super view here. And now we can add our constraints and we can check in landscape as well as portrait. And also we can inspect our constraints in more detail by clicking on it and looking at the attribute inspector. So that's pretty easy, but the next part gets harder because how are we going to lay out all four of these elements on screen in this layout and make sure that it looks decent in the landscape orientation as well? Because the problem here is that, firstly, we can't simply just use alignment because we don't actually have anything that's right in the middle of our screen. There's nothing that exists here. And if we wanted to use pinning, well, we don't actually have enough vertical space to be able to pin all of our elements together. So what can we do instead? Well, we could use some containers to split up the screen into 3 equal parts. And then we can embed each of these elements inside its own container. So now the super view to this particular logo will be this purple container, and we can set it to be vertically and horizontally aligned in the middle of that container. So let's give that a go. Let's start by creating a container. To do that, all we need to do is go to our object library and locate a view element. Now, because there's a lot of things that are called views, table view, image view, progress view, I find it's usually easier to type UI view, which is actually the underlying element here. And it's simply just an empty view. And in this case, we're using it to lay out some of the subviews, so something that we're going to put inside this container. Let's click and drag it onto our screen, and I'm going to put it somewhere near the top here. And then we're going to drag it out, and now we need to embed our Dicey logo inside this new view. And to do that, I'm going to click and select my Dicey logo, and then drag it so that this little circle here is indented below the view. So this shows that it's going inside, whereas when it's alongside it, it means it'll be just parallel. So we know that the layout of our view goes from the bottom to the top. So this is at the very top, and then it's this at the next level, then this, and this is at the very bottom. So our eye is looking this direction. We could change where our Dicey logo lives relative to that new view, but in our case, we actually want it to be inside the view. So we need it to be embedded. So we get this effect. So now that we've embedded our Dicey logo in its own view, let's go ahead and embed these two dice image views in its own container in the middle. And I'm going to use a different way of embedding. I'm going to go to Editor, and then I'm going to go to Embed In, and I'm going to select a view. So now the two dice image views have been embedded in its own view. And it's exactly the same thing as what we did before, but it's perhaps a little bit easier, a little bit quicker. And finally, for the roll button, I'm going to show you a third way of embedding in a view, which is to click on this button and then embed in view. So depending on which method you remember or you find easiest, then you can choose whichever way you want to do it, but they all do the same thing. So now we have 3 views and they're all called view, so it's a little bit confusing. So we can go ahead and select it and then click on the identity inspector and give it a label. So we can call this one the middle view because it's right in the middle. And we can call this one the top view and maybe this one the bottom view. So now we've got all 3 on screen and we can collapse them and you can rearrange them if you want to make sure that it says top, bottom and middle, although be careful that you don't accidentally embed one of the views in another one. So by the end you should have all of them aligned to the same indentation, showing that none of these are inside each other, but they are all inside the super view. And now we have our 3 containers, which can now be used to lay out these subviews or these items that are inside it. So for example, our Dicey logo can now be aligned to the horizontal and vertical center of that top view. But notice that as soon as we do that, we get an error. If we click on this button, it tells us what the problems are. And it's because even though we've defined the constraints for the logo, well, the location of this container view is kind of ambiguous. We don't know where to put it for its X position or for its Y position, because it's currently kind of just hanging out in the middle without any constraints of its own. So how can we give it some constraints? Well, to explore that and more, I'll see you on the next lesson.